as we know, the story of Christ, who was born into the opposite. So the Buddha had this world of privilege, and this is what he grew up with. He didn't really know much more than that. He was treated with great reverence from an early age because of his exalted position in society. So this early life was a life of sensual satisfaction. All of his desires were, or at least most of them, were really there at hand to be satisfied. Right up to his life as a young man, getting married, and at the point of inheriting what I suppose was his father's title. So he had quite a life of privilege laid out for him. So this was his experience up to about the age of his late 20s. Now at that point there was something in his life that was leading to a sense of dissatisfaction. Although he had all this privilege and all this satisfaction, there was something missing for Siddhartha Gautama. And this came into high relief when he ventured out one day into the local village. And he saw four sights, four significant things that really, in a way, consolidated this feeling of dissatisfaction. He saw a sick person. He saw an old person. He saw a corpse. And he also saw a wandering shramana, or a monk, as they would have been in those days. So four significant things that really brought to light for him that life was not all that he thought it had been. Now obviously he wasn't naive enough to have thought that there was no death or no sickness, but I think these very visceral sights brought them in extreme contrast to the life he had been living. And he decided that he needed to address this suffering that was at the heart of his own existence. Why did we get old? Why did we suffer with sickness? Why did we die? You know, if this life was to live, why was death this sort of cruel punchline? And part of the answer to that question came in the fourth sight that he had of the wandering shramana, the monk. This person who had set forth from home to maybe address some of these issues. So this was Siddhartha Gautama's decision at that point, was to take the lead of this monk and decide to set forth from his life of sensual pleasure to try and address this problem of suffering, of distress, of dissatisfaction, that his great life of privilege could not provide him with an answer for. So he did this, and he set out for 5 or 6 years on this path. And the Buddha, as he was to become, spent these years trying out various different ascetic practices. And we must remember that India at the time was full of different teachers, and some of them great teachers, offering solutions to this question that the Buddha was asking. What is the solution to our suffering? What can solve our suffering? And a lot of these solutions involved very extreme practices that in a way worked against, let's say, our natural inclinations and our natural desires. So some of them might have involved not eating for a long period of time, taking up very extreme yogic postures for a long period of time, or isolating oneself from contact with other human beings for a long period of time. And the Buddha, as he was to become, tried these out for a long period of time. And he in fact became very well renowned for these practices. If anything, he became the most high-level practitioner of these ascetic practices. And as the years went by, more and more what came to him was that none of these practices actually truly led him to feel that this answer to the question of suffering had really been addressed for him. And it was most immediately illustrated for him on one occasion where, very, very close to death, at the end of one of these periods of intense fasting, he was at the point of dying. And he realized at this point that the death from these ascetic practices, and to die at that point, would not have led him to solving this problem. And at this point, a young woman came to him and offered him a bowl of porridge, rice porridge. And in that moment, he took the bowl and he started to eat. And he realized that if he ate, he could continue this quest. That if he fed the body, it would allow him more time. So, this point was a pivotal point in his journey. And this is where I go back to this idea of what I was talking about earlier, where the Buddha's own experience was leading him to insight. What was happening to him in his life was teaching him and leading him towards this point of great enlightenment that he achieved. So the offering of the bowl of rice porridge was an offering to move somewhere else other than this extreme of asceticism. So he had already experienced this life of sensual pleasure for most of his youth and his early adulthood. He had tried 6 years of these very intense ascetic practices, but neither had worked. Neither had really answered the question of suffering for him. So at the point of nourishing his body and bringing him back to this sense of being able to pursue this path of inquiry, another image came to his mind, and the Buddha remembered seeing at some point a musician. And the musician was tuning a lute or a guitar, something of the type that would have existed in India at the time. And the musician was explaining to him that if he tightened the string of the lute too tightly, the string would not vibrate and could not produce a sound. But if the string on the lute was too slack, again it would not produce a sound. So this image of the string being too tight or too loose began to bring to mind in the Buddha the idea that actually the path to understanding came somewhere between these two extremes. So between the extreme of sense pleasure and between the extreme of extreme asceticism, there existed, like the string on the lute, a point at which the perfect note could be played. So it was this path of balance that became the path that the Buddha took. And that for him allowed one to truly seek insight and wisdom in the world. So just to dig a little bit deeper into that and to look at what those extremes, in a way, why they, as in the Buddha's own words, led to a dead end. It wasn't just in the more practical issues that stem from those two paths, but even the philosophical ones. You know, what can come from a path of sense pleasure is a sort of an ideology of nihilism, you know, of a way in which it's only the hedonistic pleasures of the life that can give us any meaning. It's only the immediate pleasures of the body that can bring satisfaction. You know, that nothing else has real meaning. So it can lead us down this path of sort of very empty sort of spiritual, philosophy. Whereas on the other hand, a path of asceticism, which is a sense that somehow we can escape the confines and the restrictions of the body, can lead us to a very eternalistic view of the world, where, it's only the spirit that matters. It's only what lies after life, after the imperfection of this reality. And that in some way that it's only that perfection that we can strive for. So it's a kind of an eternalism. And the Buddha saw these as two ways of leading oneself astray on the path. And crucially, what this leads us astray from is a direct experience of the world as it is. In both cases, we are trying to push away what is directly before us. So with sense pleasure, with a hedonistic approach, it's often a life of distraction, of pushing away what we don't want and only craving what will bring us pleasure. So if whatever is before us is uncomfortable or difficult, we will reach for sense pleasure to try and appease that. Whereas on the other hand, we can do the same thing with ascetic practices. That somehow our world as it is at the moment, again, is not satisfactory, and we reach towards a kind of a higher ideal or spiritualism that will, somehow things will be better in the future. That in some ways the body is imperfect, that even the mind as it exists right now is imperfect, and we're reaching after an ideal that in some ways may never actually be satisfied. But each of those approaches leads us away, as I say, from what is going on right now, what is happening right here. In that moment of silence that we started with, that's what we're experiencing in it all the time. That is what we have. That is all we have at our disposal. And if we stop, if we quieten ourselves, if we sit still, we get to experience that as it really is. And this is our starting point. This is the middle way. It's the seat of understanding, of insight. And as the Buddha discovered as he sat for 6 days under the Bodhi tree, it is the path to nirvana, to complete awakening. And the Buddha made that very clear. He didn't pull any punches. When he turned the first wheel of the Dharma in the deer park to some of his previous ascetic practitioners, he said this. And actually, I will read his words. I have them written down here. So this is from the Dhamma Chakavatana Sutta. This is from some of the very early teachings of the Buddha written down. And this is what he said to some of his first followers. He said, "Monks, these two extremes ought not to be practiced. The addiction to sense pleasures, and the addiction to self-mortification. Avoiding both these extremes, the Buddha has realized the middle path. It leads to calm, insight, and to nirvana. And what is that middle path? It is the noble Eightfold Path." Now, you may remember Swami spoke of the Four Noble Truths the other day, and the fourth of those Noble Truths is the Eightfold Path itself. And this is the path of the middle way that the Buddha taught. It is one of his first teachings. And this comes from his own insight, from his own experience. And as I said before, not from any revelation on high, not from some secret teaching, from the experience of his own life. And this is the truly great achievement of Shakyamuni Buddha that we must be truly grateful for. And it's often chanted in monasteries around the Buddhist world. This is a chant that is often, and I'll end with this. There is a middle way between the extremes of indulgence and self-denial, free from sorrow and suffering. This is the way to peace and liberation in this very life. So I'll end with that. Thank you all. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Peace to you all.
Reverend Gomoku.
Oh.
Thank you so much for your talk. Very much enjoyed. Would you mind to maybe touch a little bit on your work in Ireland? Maybe it goes off a little bit off point of your talk, but would you mind to just give us a little brief outline of your work and what you do?
Oh, of course, yeah. So, thank you very much, Brian. I didn't really touch too much on Zen Buddhism. I mean, there's a very long history of Buddhism, 2,500 years, and Zen is part of that great history. So I'm a Zen Buddhist practitioner. Zen Buddhism originated in China, although it has direct links to India, and the branch of Zen that I practice comes from Japan. It's been in the West for about 50 or 60 years now, and we're currently based in Dublin, in the city centre, in Temple Bar. We have a Zen centre there that's very recently opened. And we have a Sangha of roughly, I'd say, about, at its broadest, about 30 people. And we have opened our doors to various meditation practitioners to come in. So you don't need to be a Zen Buddhist to visit us. You can join us. We have an introduction to Zen class at the centre at the moment, and we would also perform various rituals and ceremonies out of that centre as well. So really, to answer your question directly, I suppose at the moment we're very much just about offering a space in the city for that practice of meditation, and that, you know, in a way, a place of peace and stillness within the centre of the city. And also for people to learn about Buddhism, to learn about Zen. As time goes on, though, and to really get, you know, the full use out of the centre, we'd certainly like to broaden our activities and offer people more, really, in the way of education around Buddhism, and maybe even sort of, trying to bring Buddhism and Zen Buddhism more into the culture of Ireland and the culture of Dublin. I think a lot of Irish people are aware of Buddhism, but there's an awful lot of misconceptions about it. What are the core teachings? What can people gain from living a Buddhist life? In terms of ethics and their own lifestyle. So really, I would say again, to answer your question, that would be fundamentally what we want to do, is to bring Buddhism more into the culture of Ireland and bring it to the attention of as many people as possible. So I hope that answers your question somewhat.
No, yes, indeed. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Yeah, I see someone has put a question in the chat there. I'll just check it. So Shraddha is asking, thanks for your talk. How do I go about in everyday life following the middle way? That is a brilliant question. So thank you, Shraddha. Really appreciate that. Because I think that is really at the heart of why I brought that up as the topic of the talk, because it really is a very applicable way of living. And I think this is the great gift of Shakyamuni Buddha, that he gave us something that is so practical and so useful. So the way I would put it is that, I mean, it really does come from my talk. I think we need to be sensitive in our lives. You know, are we moving in one or other of those directions? And I think what it actually does come down to, let's forget about, the extremes of asceticism, or the fact that all of us don't live in a palace and have servants serving us our meals and things like that. We may not live with those two extremes in our lives, but we do live with two extremes that we do have, and one is craving, and the desire to have things, So that's one side of it. The other is we do live with aversion. We live with the sense that we don't want certain things. We don't want to deal with certain things, So I suppose the middle way for me is finding a place somewhere in the middle of those two things. So can we find ourselves in that place? Can we be mindful enough and aware enough to know when we're craving, when we're in the grip of that thirst, tanha, as the Buddha described it in his Pali language, this thirst for things. Are we in the grip of that? Or are we in the grip of aversion, of just not wanting something, of pushing things away? Wanting instead of that to be in some perfect idealized state, So if we can be sensitive to these two things, and this is where our practice comes in Zen Buddhism we sit in what we call shikantaza, in just sitting, to allow ourselves to sit with these two things. If craving is present, to sit with craving, to give it that space, to just let it burn out, to let aversion burn out, and to find ourselves back in the middle, back in that place. And this is the place of nirvana. This is the peace of nirvana. It's not some impossible to achieve state of mind. The middle way through the Eightfold Path brings us to this place of nirvana. So again, to answer your question, this is how we live it out in our lives. We allow craving to arise, we allow aversion to arise, but we let it go, we let it burn out, and we find ourselves back in the middle, back in the place of peace. And in that place of peace we can respond in an ethical and a mindful way to what's going on. So I hope that answers your question, Shraddha. Thanks for such an excellent question as well. So I don't know if anybody else wants to ask it. Oh, I have one in the room here. So yeah.
So you mentioned about cultural differences as well. So you are preaching a religion that originates in Oriental systems, the dharmic traditions, and you are preaching them here. So how do you go over the cultural differences to convey the basic core of the religion here?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So just in case it didn't come up on Zoom, the question was, how do we teach something that comes from a different cultural context in our current cultural situation? And I think that's a really pertinent question. So as I was referring to earlier about in answer to Brian's question, how are we bringing this to the Irish context? I think we have to be very careful. I often think of it like if you have a river and you want to get across the river, you have stepping stones on the river. So you have a stone placed maybe 10 stones across the river. We're walking from one stone to the next to make our way to the other side. But it's important to have 1 foot on one stone to get to the next stone. So we're always going to have 1 foot from where we came in order to allow us to place our foot on the next stone. And this is the way I very much see it with Buddhism, and it may be the same with your own practice of Vedanta as well, that it would be very foolish to forget the stone or the place that we're coming from, in as much as it would be foolish to disregard where we're placing our foot right now. So I like to think, and again this goes back to the middle way, that we can find a place somewhere in between, of that point of travelling from one to the other. And I think in Zen Buddhism Ireland, we're very conscious of that. You know, we bring a lot of the Japanese tradition to Ireland, but we also introduce elements of what is going to be understood culturally here as well. How do we fit into what's going on in the modern world? And it's not just Irish culture, it's Western culture as well. So it's to be sensitive, it's to have an ear for that, but also really importantly not to forget the tradition. I mean, I'll give you an example. I wear the robes here. So I wear the robe of the Buddha himself, the Okesa. This is the robe of India, sewn by the early Buddhist monks. Inside that is the Koromo. This is the robe of Chinese practice. So our tradition came through China. Below that is the robe of the kimono, the Japanese culture, which we are, you know, this is the stepping stone we are just stepping away from. And I often joke that I have a T-shirt underneath, which is an AC/DC T-shirt. So this is the this is the robe of the West. It's underneath them all. So we follow through. We keep all traditions. We wear all traditions as we pass through them. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So I don't know if there are any other questions, or have I spoken enough? I've gone much further than my moment of silence at the start. I see Dermot is raising his hand there. Dermot, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could say something about time. Like, you know, how, as I've heard you, maybe I haven't picked it up right, but if you're looking at aversion and attachment, then you're in the present moment, so it's now.
Yeah.
So then there's the issue then, like, of future planning. There's the issue of death, which all beings face, and the people around, which goes back to the Buddha's original experiences.
Yeah.
So there's a time frame in a sense in that our very bodies are aging. You know, our knees are giving out, or whatever. Our hearing is diminishing. Our senses are diminishing. And so I know you can see that in terms of attachment. But the mind itself and the image of the self to the self, and that most people have a history of self-interpretation.
Yeah.
That, you know, what you think you were when you were 10. You know, so there's the whole tissue of those self-interpretations. So could you say something then about the Buddhist concept of the self and time?
Yeah.
And how, you know, whether that's evolved or whether it's or whether there's a destination. I don't know why I'm putting a travel metaphor into it.
Yeah. That's a big question. Yeah, and actually, you know, one of the core teachings of the Buddha, and particularly of early Buddhism, is the notion of anatta or anatman. So it is of no self or non-self. And I mean, you know, in a way, we need to start with that to address your question. So in essence, what the Buddha was saying is that we do not have a fixed self. There is no, and this is with respect to where we differ from the Vedanta tradition as well. There's no, you know, there's no sort of soul or Atman that we reach for to say, well, this is where we go back to, you know. This is what, you know, this is what carries through everything. And I think it's important to make this distinction as a Buddhist, because it does make it easier to address your question in that way. So to be kind of upfront about it in that respect is important. So there is nothing in our experience, and the Buddha spoke of the aggregates, the 5 aggregates which make up the conditioned human being, as being completely impermanent. So there's nothing there to grasp. There's nothing, so our identification with that is our problem. This is what is causing our suffering. Whether it's identification with mind or identification with the body. This is where our suffering is originating, So, this idea of who we were before or who we might become, of our current aging, of our previous birth, of our future death, is actually irrelevant to the present moment. And this very much is at the heart of Zen practice, because we, Shikantaza, which is our practice, is the fundamental practice of Zen Buddhism. And this is experiencing things as they are, right now. So future thoughts of what may happen of our own death are irrelevant. What we were in the past doesn't matter anymore. It's what we experience right now. Yeah.
Could I?
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry for.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it just a thought struck me. Is it that now is consciousness? Consciousness is I don't know if the word is apersonal. The fiction is the person, but there is consciousness has to be there for there to be an experience. Even not now, there has to be consciousness. So,
yeah.
But where does the vibration of consciousness come from? Or is that the?
Yeah, that's a huge question. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, and one of the aggregates that the Buddha spoke of was consciousness. So early Buddhist teaching is that consciousness is is something that is impermanent. Now, to be fair to the tradition, within Zen Buddhism, we're a little less sort of descriptive about it in that way. There is certainly a sense that, like you say, the fictional self is something that really is the thing not to be attached to, not to, that is the self that can be, dissolved or dissipated, and that consciousness is possibly the one thing that we can absolutely be sure of, that is there, and it is there in the present moment. But I think where Zen and Buddhism in general will stop short of is a kind of a reification of that consciousness, of a sense that in some way is has a solidity in and of itself, or something that can be identified with. So we need to be very careful about that, Yeah.
When you say reification, do you mean that, like, that would be turning consciousness into a concept, rather than, now it's actual, and it's conscious, and it doesn't, if you get rid of, or if you find the middle way between aversion and attachment, you're still back in now,
Yeah.
and consciousness and experience is still there. I mean, there are implications, I imagine, from that. In that it would mean if you truly, if you're truly aware of that, in a way, you were unified with all beings by that act. By that awareness makes you,
Yeah.
unified.
Yeah. I know where you're coming from, and I certainly see the distinction between Vedanta and Buddhism is, I think, really hinges around this question. But you see, I think what's important is that you equated being with consciousness there. Now, that's where Buddhism would stop, because in a way that's another form of identification. Where the Buddhists are not denying consciousness in any way, that it is, because we're conscious. But to
you'd have to be conscious.
You'd have to, exactly. So there's an inherent contradiction. So I'm completely accepting that. But again, it's this, because this idea of identification is so crucial, particularly in relation to aversion and craving. It's very dangerous, and the Buddhists have noted this, to start to apply a sense of thingness or beingness to consciousness itself. So that that's where I would caution.
I mean, maybe really that's where this discussion ends.
Yeah.
That we're back to our starting point of silence, which was your first act.
Yes. Yeah. But and that's a lovely point, Dermot, and I really appreciate that, to go back to that, because aren't we just going back to experience? This is what we have, And your question included the idea of time. Our great teacher Dogen, who is one of the great teachers of our tradition, talks about time being. This is one of his so time is wrapped up in our experience, in being itself. They are one. His point is that they are one and the same thing. So we come back to our experience, and often that's best expressed through silence. So I really appreciate you bringing that back in. Thank you. Thank you, Dermot. Thank you. So great questions. I don't know. Again, I'll ask the Swami. How are we for time?
Okay.
Yeah. If there's any more questions, I'm very happy to take them. But maybe this will be the last one, just to be conscious of time, as we were speaking. Yeah. Or does anybody want to be time for a while? Okay. So. I'm so sorry I missed one of the questions there. I didn't see it come up in the So the Eightfold Path. I don't know if I'm sure Swami went over it with the Four Noble Truths. So essentially, it really is the path. This is the middle way that I was talking about, and it's the fourth of the Four Noble Truths. So we've the truth of suffering, the truth of craving, the truth of nirvana or stopping. Then we have the Eightfold Path. So the path marks out a way of achieving this place of peace, this middle point that I spoke about earlier. So in the path we have right understanding, we have right thought, we have right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So I won't go into all of those individually. I don't think we'd have time here. But in a way, what you can see is it's a way in every part of our lives to practice the Buddha way. So to practice the teachings of the Buddhas in terms of our speech, in terms of our actions. And actually, one I will talk about, it's the very first one, which is right understanding. So the reason that's the first of the Eightfold Path is that it's very important that we have a true understanding of reality to allow us to progress, to allow us to be right or appropriate in our other actions and our other in the way we speak and so on, and in our practice as well. And as I said in my talk, a good way of having right understanding is to inquire, is to look at reality ourselves through our practice, particularly through our meditation practice, and to really test reality. The Buddha actually had quite a scientific sort of approach to the world. You know, he said to many of his followers, test my words, test my actions, see do these things work for you, study your own experience. And the Eightfold Path gives us a path of practice to do that. So yeah, so that is the Eightfold Path. This is how we as Buddhists live our lives. So I hope that covers it. I could say a lot more about the Eightfold Path, but I won't. I'll be conscious of everyone's time. So thank you again. Yeah. Oh, okay. So I think that's it, and thank you so much for your time and for listening to me, and I look forward to the next time I visit. So, Slán.
Good morning.
Thank you for all of your questions, and it was a very good interactive session too. And I thank Reverend Priest for his scholastic talk. And the same idea we can see in Bhagavad Gita, where 5,000 or 10,000 years before, even Shri Krishna said the same idea. Yukta ahara viharasya, yukta chestasya karmasu, yukta swapnava bodhasya, yogo bhavati dukkha. Yoga helps a man, or yoga can check the unhappiness or misery for such a person who is moderate in his food, who is moderate in his sleep, who is moderate in his reaction, or who is moderate in his recreation and other things. So we have to take this moderate path. Even Swami Vivekananda also some places we have to avoid the extreme opposites. It is better for all of us. Only few people probably will be able to take that. Otherwise, definitely extreme opposites should be avoided by all means. Even Swami Vivekananda he re-echoes the Buddha's teachings. I thanks from Éire Vedanta Society and personally for Reverend Priest to give his scholastic talk, and thank for all the devotees online and offline for the part of this Buddha Jayanti celebration. Thank you.